Hello there, Cav P here. Those of you who already know me probably noticed that I took a hiatus of about 2 years from making YouTube videos. Those of you watching this in the future hopefully have had no such shortage of Cav P videos, so this will presumably be surprising to all of you. Just believe me when I say I was gone for a long while. So why was I gone for so long? Well, short answer, global pandemic and ADHD diagnosis aside, I was working through PTSD from what started as the best relationship I ever had and ended up as the most toxic and damaging. Too much information? Bear with me on this one, I promise you it's relevant to this video. Over the period of a year, I was gaslit by someone whom I trusted completely. No, I don't mean they told me I was wrong, so I was gaslit like too many people on the internet do. I'm talking more about they would agree to or suggest something, and then later on tell me they never agreed to or suggested that thing, and that I'd actually pressured them into thinking it was something they wanted, doing this over a long period of time, to the point where I believed I was losing my grip on reality and couldn't trust my own memories. After realizing that this was something that happened, I tried to mitigate the damage. I mean, nobody wants to hurt the person they care about the most. I'd reassure the person that it was okay to say no, because I genuinely had no strong feelings either way. And it was true, despite my dearth of online opinions, I actually have very few special preferences when it comes to domestic life. If they said yes to something in advance, I'd ask them again the next day if they still felt the same way, again reassuring them that it was actually not a big deal to me and it would be fine if they changed their mind. I'd ask them in the lead up to and during the event, the meal, the TV show, whatever, if they were actually enjoying themselves or if they wanted to do, eat, see something else instead. I'd give them options and ways out wherever I could to try to take the pressure off them. Regardless of my approach, it would still happen relatively frequently. They would insist that everything was great and they were having a great time, and then afterwards ask me why I pressured them. It got to the point where I was preparing a notepad to write down whenever they suggested something or told me my idea was great. Not for an I told you so later, but just simply so I could reassure myself that my memory was sound, that I wasn't imagining this person's enthusiasm for the idea that I had, or that they were the one who suggested something in the first place. As it turns out, one person's debilitating fear of disappointing people made me slowly lose my grip on reality and completely changed the way my brain processes information, even to this day. It took me about a year after the breakup to realize I actually had PTSD from my experiences with this person, including experiences from prior to and after our romantic relationship. There was no physical violence involved, and it was very clear that for the most part, the harm that was done to me was not intentional, but a product of their bafflingly low self-esteem. So it was hard to realize why exactly I was so traumatized. Yet somehow I just couldn't move on the way I did after one partner of 5 years started stalking me post-breakup, or after another partner left me stranded in South America with no visa and no ticket back home. Clearly there was something about this one which was still haunting me. The moment when I finally realized I had a problem was when I invited a friend to come with me to a film festival, and they were on the fence, and I told them more information about it, and then after thinking about it, they told me they'd decided to come, upon which point I burst into tears and felt like the biggest piece of shit in the world for pressuring someone yet again to do something they hadn't wanted to do. Only it turns out the person did actually decide to do the thing on their own volition, and I hadn't pressured them. I just convinced them. And those were apparently two completely different concepts. Stay with me, folks, it's coming to a head. The biggest issue that I had coming to terms with what happened to me was the feeling of living two realities, or rather living the same life with two completely different people. There was the person who was laid back and charming, who told me regularly that they'd never been happier, and the person who was cold and emotionless, who said every so often that they'd been unhappy in their relationship for a long time. Each of these people would deny the other's existence, as well as the things that the other person had said. After a day of wondering what I was doing wrong to make this person I cared about so unhappy, they would be in a better mood and tell me that they were just feeling off that day, so I should completely ignore everything I had experienced and heard in the previous communication, because there was absolutely nothing I could or should be doing differently. Even though the happy persona seemed to be in control of this person's body 95% of the time, it was impossible to know who to trust. Which was the one who only told the truth, and which was the one who only told lies? So fast forward to me in therapy with a specialist in relationship issues. After explaining my background to the therapist over a number of sessions, it seemed that she understood where my issues lay. She told me something absolutely, crushingly simple and obvious, but in practice completely mind-blowing. What if these two realities you experienced were actually the same? And what if that's okay? Until then, my way of processing this relationship went something along the following lines. They would talk and act like they were really happy, but then they would also say that they had been immensely unhappy the whole time. My therapist suggested changing the but in that sentence to an and seeing how that changed my perception of the events of my relationship. They would talk and act like they were really happy, and they would also say that they had been immensely unhappy the whole time. All of a sudden, two realities became one. Two people became one person. It seems almost childishly straightforward, but it made room for the complexity of human behavior. One person can be two different ways simultaneously, and it's hard and it hurts so much, but that's who that person is as a whole. They aren't two-faced. That's just how they are, for better or worse. And there's somehow closure in that, because you weren't seeing two sides of the same person after all. You were seeing the complete package the whole time. A fully fleshed out human being, both kind and terrible, complete with tenderness and toxic, destructive character flaws. Those of you who've been fortunate enough to never have been involved in a toxic familial or romantic relationship might be watching this video now in intense bemusement, wondering why any of this was a revelation to me. But you really need to appreciate how cognitive syntax works. There's a grammar to our thoughts, and oftentimes we aren't aware of it. This can lead to contradictions in how we process the things that happen around us, and in turn lead to black and white thinking if we're not careful. For the simple reason that it's easier to process things in black and white. This person is bad. This person is good. Violence is bad. Science is objective, etc., etc. So when someone who we admire or who made, say, a young adult book series that we adore turns out to be engaged in truly horrific behavior, an internal crisis might happen if we don't take a look at how our cognitive grammar is processing the information. I like this book series, but I just found out the author is bad. Am I a bad person for liking this bad person's book series? You see where I'm going with this? I'm not going to be using this video to suggest that we should judge an artwork separate from the artist, or that we should give toxic people who have hurt us a second chance. The last thing I want to do as a survivor is to defend these people who have done or said horrible things, or indeed their body of work. What I am going to do here is to offer this strategy that was useful for me, to help you to process difficult emotions, accept the inherent complexity of things, and get to a point where you can heal. Maybe this strategy could be useful for you as well. There is often a trauma that comes with finding out that something or someone you have admired or respected has been responsible for something horrible. Because if it's true, it can feel like a betrayal. Not just a betrayal of the thing or the person against you, but a betrayal of your own mind or understanding of reality. You often can't just feel a completely different way about that thing or person in the blink of an eye, even though there may be external and internal pressure to do so. There's attachment there. Emotional attachment. In this fight or flight moment of betrayal, it's very tempting to think about things in absolute terms. It's perfectly valid and acceptable to feel anger or helplessness in this moment. My focus here is more on the long term. What do we do next? How can we process the hurt and start the healing process? Let's try changing our cognitive grammar. Let's turn our buts into ands. Buts. Of course, my phrasing of cognitive grammar is just a rebranding of the tried and trusted cognitive behavioral therapy technique of reframing. If you're interested to learn more about how it works, or maybe get some different strategies that might be more effective to you, I'd recommend doing a quick search for cognitive behavioral therapy reframing and checking out a few worksheets. The term cognitive grammar is just a phrasing that really worked for me in this specific situation to understand what was going on. Shall we go through an example of this? I'm sure you wouldn't have to go far back to come across someone you've had respect for, either in your past or as a public figure who has been exposed as deceitful or let you down in some way. Still, you might prefer to have this contextualized a little more. Let's break it down with the case of Morrissey, lead singer of The Smiths and former counterculture icon, current far-right sympathizer. Writing depressingly awkward lyrics such as, "I look at yours, you laugh at mine," and a song literally called "I'm Not a Man." Morrissey is almost the last person you think would be passionate about a movement almost synonymous with toxic masculinity. However, in 2019, Morrissey shocked many fans when he came out in support of the far-right For Britain political party during an appearance on The Tonight Show. As it turns out, Morrissey had openly harbored xenophobic and racist views for a long time. He's courted skinheads and written morally ambiguous songs like the National Front Disco. If biographer Johnny Rogan is to be believed, he was still a teenager when he said,
"I don't hate Pakistanis, but I dislike them immensely."
But it's not particularly helpful to chastise yourself for not seeing the signs earlier. Given Morrissey's long track record for being progressive on other fronts, such as his outspoken vegetarianism and anti-monarchy streak, not to mention his open disdain for Margaret Thatcher, it was a lot easier to overlook some of these earlier oversteps as honest mistakes or misunderstandings. His constant cloaking of himself in the Union Jack flag, for one thing. It's worth noting that this is how many people end up trapped in cycles of abuse or codependency as well. It's not easy to see the signs when they're cloaked in love or affirmations. What you can do after the fact, however, is to be kind to yourself and contextualize what happened by reframing the language you use to think about the contradictions. In the case of Morrissey, he loves animals, hates the monarchy, dislikes traditional notions of masculinity, and believes Britain should be a homogenic white nation. That's Morrissey. Let's use an example from Me Too now. Remember Bill Cosby? As a national treasure best known for playing a lovable family man on TV, accusations against Cosby of the sexual abuse of more than 60 women and girls, many cases of which involved the use of sedatives against his victims, seemed impossible to believe. So great was the anger in response to these accusations that there was a huge and ultimately successful movement to get his jail sentence overturned. Not because the allegations were found to be false or misleading, but due to a legal oversight in the conviction process. If the allegations are to be believed, Cosby was abusing people for most of his career, including while he was playing the trustworthy father figure we see in the beloved The Cosby Show. And it's worth noting that although allegations had been floating around for years, the impetus for the flood of accusations in 2014 was another male comedian, Hannibal Buress, who was recorded talking about Cosby's sex abuse in his comedy routine like it was common knowledge.
Pull your pants up, black people. I was on TV in the 80s. I can talk down to you because I had a successful sitcom. Yeah, it was great women, Bill Cosby, so kind of brings you down a couple notches. That shit is upsetting. If you didn't know about it, trust me, when you leave here, Google Bill Cosby rape. It's not funny. This shit has more results than Hannibal Buress.
In fact, that was meant to be the point of the joke, that Cosby wasn't held accountable for his actions despite it being public knowledge. Buress hadn't been intending to start a social movement or to be a feminist icon. He was just doing his usual observational comedy. As I say, that it was common knowledge was literally the joke. But despite this alleged common knowledge, many still refuse to believe that there's any truth at all to the over 60 allegations. And no wonder. Cosby was such an influential and beloved icon in his time, and the accusations leveled against him run completely contrary to the squeaky clean persona that we saw on our televisions each week for decades. So how do we change our cognitive grammar here to make sense of this complete conflict of reasoning? Well, how about Bill Cosby is a comedian who played a funny family man on TV for many years and used his social capital to prey on a huge number of women and girls. The two examples I've used here both have a degree of publicly available evidence of their beliefs and actions from long before they were quote-unquote cancelled. This isn't always going to be the case, especially when it comes to non-public figures. But that doesn't mean that these conflicting behaviors haven't been existing simultaneously. It's easy to be unaware of certain behaviors or to assume the best in someone who you trust until long after it's too late to mitigate the damage they've caused. Also, so many behaviors can be interpreted in multiple ways. To defenders of Michael Jackson, his spending bizarre amounts of time alone with children in his bedroom was unambiguously innocent. He wasn't allowed to have a childhood himself, after all, and his years as a victim of abuse meant that he only felt safe in the company of children. In other words, many still believe that he was an eccentric, not an abuser. To defenders of Winston Churchill, his white supremacist beliefs and actions were a product of his time, rather than exceptionally awful even among his contemporaries, and so on and so forth. There are nuances to how we're misled or harmed by others, so it makes sense that processing these experiences also requires a degree of nuance, don't you think? And finally, the example I'm sure you've all been waiting for. Creator of the beloved Harry Potter series and outspoken transphobe J.K. Rowling. These books and films were a staple of the last few generations' childhoods. Scores of people still indicate their Hogwarts house on their dating profiles, for example. So it's no wonder that a transphobic unraveling shocked and dismayed so many of us. Bizarre social politics of the books aside, one of the main narrative thrusts involves a child who is an outsider and a misfit, neglected by their family, being swept away into a magical world where they're accepted for who they are and have the power to change things for the better. It's no wonder it was such a formative series for so many queer and trans people as well. And no wonder as well that it was such a shock for these people when someone who seemed to see them and celebrate their uniqueness suddenly revealed that they very resolutely did not. In an instant, trans people who felt like they had a home at Hogwarts were forcibly excommunicated from it by an author they loved, just because of the body they were born in. A core part of the identity and philosophy of many was ripped away from them and replaced with a resolute rejection of everything they are. And how do you even reconcile that? Let's have a try. J.K. Rowling wrote an immensely popular book series about a social misfit which thematically appealed to many queer and trans folk, and has a staunchly outdated bioessentialist position on transness which is incompatible with modern scientific consensus, and which emboldens transphobic people of all persuasions to do harm to trans people. How's that? Like I say, this isn't going to immediately change everything. But framing your understanding of the Rowling fiasco like this may set the ball rolling to help you begin to see the whole picture and come to terms with the inherent complexity of these disappointing developments. Does all this make sense? I hope it helps you even a little. Note that I'm not a trained therapist myself. I've just had a hell of a lot of therapy, especially in the wake of having PTSD from being gaslit. If there's any takeaway I want you to get from this, it's that there is a way to reconcile what you thought you knew about someone with what you know now, in a way that helps you to make sense of it and heal in your own time. Therapy is unfortunately not accessible to everyone, but the concept of reframing, or as I call it, cognitive grammar, isn't new, and you can find free guides and worksheets online if you don't have access to a therapist. And I'd like to say again that this process isn't about normalizing the harm that people do. It's about understanding that you weren't a fool for being sucked in or not seeing the forest for the trees. This process is about you, not them. It's about preparing yourself to move on in whatever form that takes. Personally, I'm hoping that the prospect of my past trauma helping other people will be the crux I need to finally break free from the chokehold this person still has on me, despite the fact that we've not spoken in a number of years. I will maintain that I wish I'd never met that person, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully forgive them for what happened during and after our relationship, but at the very least, I can forgive myself. There's a good chance that the harm that was done to me will be something I carry for the rest of my life, manifesting in anxiety triggers I have little control over. But at least I understand why it happened now, and can process that, and in doing so, perhaps make those anxiety triggers occur a little less often with less severity. And sharing this strategy may not help people who experience betrayal to see the signs of something similar happening to them before it affects them, but it will probably help some people to process their experiences after the fact in order to heal. I want to start a conversation about the importance of seeing the world in nuanced terms so that we can recognize its complexity and hopefully not end up in situations where we feel trapped by revelations of the harm that people do. So let's change our cognitive grammar and strive to see the world in all its nuances, both good and terrible. I'm Cav P, and you can do this! See you next time!